She felt the baby kick the exact moment her husband stood up in front of 300 guests and pointed at another woman. Jessica pressed her hand flat against the curve of her stomach, right there in the doorway of the Hanukkah wedding hall, the invitation card crushed and damp in her other fist, and she watched the only man she had ever built a life around open his mouth and end it in front of everyone who mattered to him. The chandelier light caught the silk of his suit. The string quartet had just finished a song, and Kwon Tae-min, her husband of 4 years, the father of the child currently pressing a tiny foot into her ribs, looked directly at her across that glittering room and said the words slowly, like he wanted every syllable to land exactly where it was aimed. "This woman," he said, one hand resting on the shoulder of a stranger in red silk, "is my future, not you." The room did not gasp. That was the part Jessica would remember for years afterward. The way 300 wealthy, powerful, perfectly composed Korean elites simply went quiet. The way silence in a room like that is its own kind of violence. Somewhere near the back, an elderly woman's spoon clinked against porcelain, and the sound carried like a gunshot. Jessica stood in the doorway in the pale blue dress she had chosen that morning, because it was the only thing left that still fit her growing belly, and she felt every eye in that hall slide toward her, then quickly away. The particular cowardice of people who don't want to be caught watching a woman get destroyed. She did not scream. She did not run. She had promised herself, somewhere on the drive over, gripping the invitation that had arrived at her door with no explanation, that whatever was waiting for her inside that hall, she would not give them a scene to whisper about for the next decade. So she simply stood there, one hand on her stomach, and let her husband's words settle into her bones like cold water. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because what happens to Jessica in the next hour is going to make you furious, and then it's going to make you stand up and cheer, and you do not want to miss a single second of it. Before we go into today's story, if you love powerful mafia boss romances filled with passion, secrets, shocking twists, and unforgettable happy endings, you'll love the Ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection. It includes 15 complete stories, 20 audiobooks, plus 5 exclusive bonus stories you won't find on YouTube. You can grab your copy through the link in the description. Now, let's begin. The woman in red silk, the one Tae-min had just declared his future in front of his entire family, his business partners, 2 assemblymen, and his pregnant wife, did not even have the decency to look uncomfortable. Her name was Han Yoo-jin, 26 years old, the daughter of a textile fortune that had been quietly courting the Kwon family for 2 generations, and she sat there with her chin lifted and her eyes bright, with the specific satisfaction of a woman who has just won something she'd been told for months she would win. She did not look at Jessica. She looked at the room, the way a queen looks at a coronation crowd, already practicing the posture she would wear for the rest of her life. Tae-min, Jessica's voice, when it finally came, surprised her with how steady it sounded. 4 years in Seoul had taught her many things, and one of them was how to keep her voice flat and even when everything underneath it was burning down. "What is this?" He did not answer her directly. Instead, he glanced, briefly, almost apologetically, toward the head table where his mother sat with her spine perfectly straight and her face arranged into something between disappointment and triumph. Madame Kwon had never approved of her son's African wife. Not once in 4 years. Not through the wedding, not through the engagement parties. Not through a single holiday dinner where she had corrected Jessica's chopstick grip in front of guests like she was training a particularly slow dog. And now, watching her son humiliate his pregnant wife in front of the city's elite, Madame Kwon allowed herself the smallest, coldest smile Jessica had ever seen on a human face. "My family needs an heir strategy that makes sense," Tae-min said finally. And the word strategy hit Jessica like a slap, because that was exactly what this was to him. A corporate restructuring, a line item, a decision made in a boardroom somewhere she had never been invited into. Yoo-jin understands what's required of this family. She understands the politics. "I'm sorry it has to happen this way, but it does. I am carrying your child," Jessica said. Her voice cracked, finally, on the word child, and she hated herself for it. Hated that after everything. After every careful, controlled thing she had told herself she would not do tonight, her body still betrayed her. "Right now, in this room, while you do this." "I know," he said. And that was somehow worse than anything else he could have said. because there was no remorse in it, only acknowledgement. The way you might confirm a delivery date or a meeting time. I know. As though her pregnancy were simply another data point he had already factored into his calculations. Security appeared at her elbow before she could say another word. Two men in dark suits, polite but immovable, the kind of men whose job is not to harm you, but simply to make sure you stop existing in a particular space. They did not touch her. They did not need to. The message in their presence was clear enough. This conversation is over. This humiliation is complete. Please remove yourself so the celebration can continue. Jessica looked at her husband one final time, searching his face for some flicker of the man who had once stood outside her apartment in the rain for 3 hours because he refused to leave until she agreed to one dinner with him, the man who had learned to say "I love you" in 3 different Igbo dialects just to surprise her on their first anniversary. That man was gone. Whatever was standing at the front of that hall in his tailored suit was someone else entirely. Someone who had been quietly constructed over months while she was too busy growing his child to notice the demolition happening around her. She turned. She walked out. And if you think that's the end of her story, if you think a woman gets destroyed in a wedding hall, and that's just where it ends, stay with me. Because what happened on the road outside that hall, 20 minutes later, is the moment everything in this story actually begins. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Because I promise you, by the end of this video, you're going to want to talk about what this woman becomes. The night air outside the Hanok Hall was sharp enough to make her gasp, the kind of late autumn soul cold that gets into your lungs before you're ready for it. Jessica stood on the curb in her pale blue dress with no coat, because she had not planned to need one. Because 3 hours ago, she had still believed she was walking into a family gathering and not an execution. Cars passed. Somewhere behind her, through the hall's heavy doors, she could hear the music start again. The band picking back up like nothing had happened, like a woman's entire marriage hadn't just been dissolved in front of 300 witnesses while she stood there pregnant and alone. She did not call anyone. There was no one in Seoul who belonged fully to her. Not anymore. Her own family was an ocean away in Lagos. Her mother's voice on the phone always tinged with the particular worry of a woman who had begged her daughter not to marry into a world she didn't understand. Her friends here, the few she'd kept, were mostly Taemin's friends first. Careful, polite people who would hear about tonight by morning and quietly recalibrate their loyalties the way people in that world always did. So Jessica did the only thing that made sense to a woman with nowhere obvious to go. She started walking. She did not know how long she walked, only that her heels eventually became unbearable and she stopped to pull them off, standing barefoot on the cold pavement of a side street in Gangnam, with her shoes dangling from 2 fingers, looking, she imagined, exactly like what she was, a woman whose life had just ended in public. Her phone had been buzzing in her clutch for the last 10 minutes, and she had ignored every single call, assuming it was Taemin finally working up the nerve to apologize, or worse, to explain himself further. She almost didn't look at the screen when it rang again, but something made her glance down. An unfamiliar number, Korean prefix, but not one she recognized. She almost let it go to voicemail. Then something, call it instinct, call it exhaustion, call it the particular recklessness of a woman who has just lost everything and has nothing left to protect, made her answer. Hello? Her voice came out smaller than she intended. There was a pause on the other end, just long enough that she almost hung up. Then a man's voice, deep, unhurried, carrying the kind of quiet authority that didn't need volume to fill a room. I know what they did to you tonight. Jessica stopped walking, stood very still on that empty side street, her bare feet freezing against the pavement, her heart suddenly loud in her own ears. Who is this? Someone who has known Taemin for a very long time, the voice said. Long enough to know he just made a mistake he is never going to be able to undo. A pause, weighted with something she couldn't quite name yet. My name is Choi Do-hyun. I'd like to help you, Mrs. Kwan. But I understand, if you don't trust anyone right now. I wouldn't either. Jessica did not answer immediately. She stood on that cold street with the phone pressed to her ear, weighing the voice against everything her instincts were screaming at her. Every lesson 4 years in Seoul's elite circles had taught her about men who called pregnant women alone at night with offers of help. How do you know who I am? How did you get this number? Taemin and I have known each other since university, Do-hyun said. We've done business together for years. I was supposed to be at that wedding hall tonight, actually. I had a seat at the third table. Something dry entered his voice. The faintest trace of something that might, in a different conversation, have been humor. I decided not to attend once I heard what he was planning. I didn't want to watch it happen, and I didn't think you should have to either. Except apparently, you walked into it anyway. You knew, she said slowly, the cold suddenly feeling secondary to the heat rising in her chest. You knew what he was going to do tonight. And nobody told me. I'm telling you now, Do-hyun said simply. I understand if that's not enough. I understand if you don't trust a stranger calling you out of nowhere on the worst night of your life. But you're standing on a street somewhere in this city, alone, pregnant, with nowhere obvious to go, and I would like to send a car to make sure you're safe tonight. Nothing more than that tonight. No conditions, no expectations. Just somewhere warm to sleep that isn't a hotel lobby. Jessica looked down at her bare feet, at the shoes hanging useless from her fingers, at the city stretching out around her in every direction, glittering and enormous, and suddenly entirely indifferent to her existence. She thought about Taemin's face at that podium, the flat certainty in his voice when he said the word strategy. She thought about Madame Kwan's small, cold smile. She thought about the fact that she had absolutely nowhere safe to spend tonight, that her own apartment was, technically, his apartment, that everything in her life right now belonged to a man who had just told 300 people she was disposable. Why would you do this? She said, not quite a question, more a demand for honesty before she'd give him anything else. Why would you help me? You said you've done business with him for years. What does that make you exactly? There was a pause on the line, longer this time, and when Do-hyun spoke again, something in his voice had shifted, gone careful, in a way that told Jessica he was choosing his next words very deliberately. Let's just say that in certain circles in this city, business and family and power are not separate things. They're the same thing, wearing different clothes depending on the room you're standing in. Another pause. I'm not going to lie to you tonight, Mrs. Kwan. Not about anything. But some things are easier explained in person than over a phone, on a cold street, with you standing there in bare feet. She almost laughed, despite everything, a short, broken sound that surprised her as it left her throat. He had no way of knowing about her feet, and yet somehow, the image of herself, exactly as she stood right now, barefoot and humiliated and pregnant on a Seoul side street at 11 at night, struck her as suddenly darkly funny. How do you know I'm barefoot? I don't, Do-hyun said, but I've heard a lot about you over the years, secondhand, through Taemin, and one thing he always said was that you were the most stubborn woman he'd ever met. Stubborn enough to walk out of a building in heels and keep walking until they became a problem rather than ask anyone for help. A pause. I'm guessing, but I don't think I'm wrong. This time, she did laugh. Briefly, painfully, the sound catching somewhere between a sob and genuine amusement. Because he wasn't wrong. He wasn't wrong at all, and the fact that a stranger understood something true about her in the space of a 5-minute phone call, something her own husband had apparently stopped seeing months ago, broke something open in her chest that she didn't have the energy left to hold shut. Send the car, she said finally, quietly. But I want you to know, I'm not agreeing to anything else. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. I don't know you. And after tonight, I'm done trusting men who tell me they have my best interests at heart. That's fair, Do-hyun said. And there was something in his voice that almost sounded like respect. The car will be there in 10 minutes. Black sedan, license plate starting with 04. The driver's name is Mr. Han, and he doesn't talk much, which I suspect tonight you'll appreciate. A beat. Mrs. Kwan, for whatever it's worth, and I know it's not worth much tonight, I am sorry. Not on his behalf. He doesn't get to borrow my apology. But for what happened to you in there, nobody should have to stand pregnant in a room and listen to that. She didn't respond. She couldn't, not without her voice breaking entirely, and she had cried enough silent tears walking these last 20 minutes that she refused to give this stranger the satisfaction of hearing the rest of them. She simply ended the call, slid her bare feet back into her ruined heels, and waited on the curb in the cold, watching the headlights of every passing car, wondering which one might be coming for her, and wondering, beneath that, what exactly she had just agreed to step into. To understand how Jessica Adeyemi ended up standing on that street tonight, abandoned and pregnant in a city 6,000 miles from home, you have to go back 4 years, to a woman who arrived in Seoul with nothing but a suitcase, a business degree from the University of Lagos, and a determination that had carried her through every closed door her whole life had handed her. She had come to Korea on a corporate exchange program, 26 years old, brilliant, in the specific quiet way that doesn't announce itself in a room but reveals itself slowly, in the precision of her questions, in the way she noticed things other people missed. She had not come looking for love. She had come looking for opportunity, for a career, for the kind of life her mother back in Lagos had worked 3 jobs to make possible for her. She met Kwon Tae-min at a business conference in her second month in the city, back when he was simply a rising executive at his family's shipping conglomerate, not yet the cold, calculating man who would one day stand at a podium and call her replaceable. He had approached her after a panel discussion, not with the practiced charm of a man working an angle, but with an actual question about her presentation, a genuine point of disagreement about emerging markets that turned into 2 hours of conversation neither of them had planned for. He was, in those early days, attentive in a way that disarmed her completely. He learned her favorite foods within weeks. He surprised her with phrases in broken, earnest Igbo that made her laugh until she cried. He told her on their 6th date, standing outside her apartment building in the rain because he refused to say goodnight until she'd agreed to a 7th, that he had never met anyone who made him want to be a better version of himself. She believed him. For 3 years, she had every reason to. They married in a small ceremony that Madame Kwon barely attended, a fact Jessica had chosen, at the time, to interpret generously, telling herself that cultural differences and generational stubbornness would soften with time, that love, real love, the kind they had, would eventually wear down even the coldest resistance. She left her career trajectory in Lagos behind almost entirely, building a life instead around being Mrs. Kwon Tae-min, around the social obligations and family expectations that came with marrying into one of Seoul's old shipping fortunes. She told herself it was a fair trade. She told herself every single time Madame Kwon corrected her in public or excluded her from family decisions that Tae-min's love was worth the cost of his mother's disapproval. What she did not know, what she would not learn until much later, was that the Kwon family's shipping empire was not simply a shipping empire. Beneath the legitimate contracts and the public listings and the glittering headquarters tower in Yeouido, there ran older, deeper currents, alliances forged generations back between certain powerful families and the underground networks that had always existed alongside Korea's legitimate business world, the kind of arrangements nobody discussed at dinner parties, but everyone in that rarefied circle understood, without needing to be told. Tae-min had been raised inside that world from birth, taught from childhood that legacy and bloodline and strategic alliance mattered more than any single person's feelings, including, eventually, his own wife's. When Jessica became pregnant, 8 months before that wedding hall humiliation, she had believed, with the particular hope of a woman who desperately wants something to be true, that the child would finally settle things, would finally give her a permanent place in a family that had never fully accepted her. Instead, the pregnancy seemed to accelerate something darker. Tae-min grew distant in small increments at first. Late nights at the office that stretched longer than any project required. A new coldness in his voice on the phone that she told herself was simply stress. Then came the secret meetings, the ones he thought she didn't notice, the careful way he started locking his study door. And then, finally came Han Yu-jin, introduced into his orbit not as an affair, not even as a mistress in the traditional shameful sense, but as something his family began openly calling an arrangement, a word that made Jessica's skin crawl every time she heard it spoken at the dinner table, like it was a perfectly reasonable solution to a perfectly reasonable problem. She had tried in those final months to understand. She had asked Tae-min directly, more than once, sitting across from him at their kitchen table with her hands folded over her growing belly, what exactly was happening to their marriage, what exactly his family expected of him, what exactly her place in all of this was supposed to be. He had given her nothing but vague reassurances and tired silences, the particular evasions of a man who has already made his decision and is simply waiting for the right moment to announce it. That moment, it turned out, was a wedding hall full of witnesses, chosen specifically, she would later understand, so that she would have no room to argue, no private space in which to fight for herself, only the public theater of her own erasure. She had not understood, standing in that doorway in her pale blue dress, that the man calling himself her future, The man dismissing her in front of 300 people had built his entire plan around one critical miscalculation: that a woman stripped of everything, humiliated in public and abandoned while pregnant, would simply disappear quietly into grief and shame, exactly the way the world had always expected broken women to behave. Tae-min Kwan had no idea, as he sat back down beside Han Yu-jin and accepted the congratulations of his mother's closest friends, that somewhere across the city, in a black sedan, with a driver named Mr. Han who didn't talk much, his pregnant ex-wife was being carried toward a man who was about to teach her something Tae-min himself had never quite mastered: how power actually moves in the world he came from, and who truly holds it. The car that arrived for Jessica was exactly as Do-hyun had described: sleek and black, license plate beginning with 04, driven by a silent, broad-shouldered man who simply nodded once when she approached and opened the rear door without a word. She hesitated only a moment before climbing inside, every nerve in her body still humming with the adrenaline of the night, still half expecting this to be some final cruelty, some elaborate trap designed by Tae-min's family to finish what the wedding hall had started. But the car simply pulled away from the curb and moved smoothly through Seoul's nighttime streets, the city lights sliding past the windows in long, silent streaks. And slowly, despite everything, Jessica felt some small portion of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. They drove for nearly 40 minutes, away from the glittering towers of Gangnam and toward the quieter, older wealth of a neighborhood she didn't immediately recognize: tree-lined streets where the houses sat behind high walls and security gates, the kind of old money that didn't need to announce itself, with chandeliers and marble lobbies. The car eventually slowed in front of a traditional Hanok estate, beautifully restored, lit softly from within, looking less like the lair of a dangerous underworld figure and more like something out of a heritage magazine. Jessica sat very still for a moment, taking it in, before the driver came around and opened her door. Choi Do-hyun was waiting at the entrance. He was not what she had expected. She had built, in her mind, some image of a hardened, intimidating figure to match the voice on the phone, the careful authority of it, the dry edge of dark humor underneath. Instead, the man standing in the warm light of the entrance was perhaps mid-30s, tall, dressed simply in a black sweater and dark trousers, with an unhurried stillness about him that reminded her, oddly, of a man who had spent a long time learning patience, because the alternative had cost him something once. His eyes, when they met hers, were direct, without being aggressive, assessing, without making her feel like an object being assessed. "Mrs. Kwan," he said, and then, with the faintest correction in his voice, "Or perhaps I shouldn't call you that anymore. I apologize. I'm not sure what you'd prefer." "Jessica is fine," she said, and was surprised by how steady her own voice sounded, given everything. "I don't think I want to be called Mrs. Kwan ever again, honestly." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face, gone almost before it arrived. "Understandable." He gestured toward the open doors behind him, warm light and the smell of something cooking spilling out into the cold night air. "Please, come in. You must be exhausted, and you haven't eaten, I'm guessing, not properly, not in a long time, given how the evening went." She stepped inside, and the warmth hit her immediately, a physical relief after the cold of the street. And for the first time all night, standing in the entryway of a stranger's home, Jessica Adeyemi allowed herself to feel, just for a moment, something close to safe. It would not last, she knew. Not really, not in a world like the one she had just glimpsed the edges of, but for tonight, it was enough. "I have a lot of questions," she said, watching him carefully as he led her toward a sitting room, the floors warm beneath her bare, ruined feet. "And I think you owe me real answers." Do-hyun stopped, turned to face her fully, and for the first time that night, something in his expression went entirely serious, entirely without the careful diplomacy he'd offered on the phone. "You're right," he said. "You do deserve real answers, and I'm going to give them to you. But I want you to understand something first, Jessica, before I tell you who I really am and why I called you tonight." He paused, and the silence stretched just long enough to make her hold her breath. "What happened to you in that hall tonight wasn't only a betrayal of you. It was the first domino in something much bigger than your marriage. And by the time I'm done explaining it to you, you're going to understand exactly why Tae-min Kwan should never, ever have made an enemy out of his own wife. She sat across from him in the warm, low light of the sitting room, a cup of barley tea going untouched in her hands, and waited. Do-hyun did not rush. He settled into the chair across from her with the unhurried economy of a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, that information delivered too quickly was information people didn't actually absorb. Outside, somewhere beyond the Hanok's wooden lattice windows, the city continued its indifferent hum, and Jessica sat very still and let the silence stretch until he was ready. Taemin's family, Do-hyun said finally, isn't simply a shipping dynasty. That's the part the business journals print, the part that goes in the annual reports and the magazine profiles. It's true, as far as it goes, but underneath it, going back 3 generations, the Kwon family has maintained an alliance with a network most people in this city pretend doesn't exist anymore. He watched her face carefully as he spoke, gauging how much she could absorb in one sitting. An organization, old, disciplined, deeply embedded in legitimate business, in ways that make it almost impossible to separate the two anymore. Some people still call it by an old name. Most people in my world simply call it the network, because by now it doesn't need a more dramatic title to be taken seriously. And you, Jessica said slowly, setting her tea down with hands that were not quite steady, are part of this network. I run a significant portion of it, Do-hyun said, without flinching, without softening it. Not the violent caricature you're probably imagining right now, though I won't pretend that history is entirely clean, because it isn't. Mostly what I run is influence, capital, information, the kind of leverage that makes wars happen without anyone ever needing to fire a gun. He leaned forward slightly. Taemin's father and my own father were partners for 30 years. Taemin and I grew up at the same dinner tables, went to the same private schools, were groomed, in different ways, for exactly the kind of world that just humiliated you tonight. So you're friends, Jessica said, and something bitter crept into her voice despite herself. You're his friend, and you watched him build this arrangement, for months, and you said nothing to me. We were friends, Do-hyun corrected, quietly, past tense, as of about 6 months ago, when I started understanding exactly what kind of man he'd let himself become to satisfy his mother's ambitions. He paused. I want to be honest with you, Jessica, because I think you've had more than enough of people managing the truth around you tonight. Taemin and I have had business disagreements building for over a year. His family's expansion into certain shipping routes threatens infrastructure my side of the network has controlled for 2 decades. We are, as of recently, what polite people in my world would call rivals. There it was. Jessica felt something cold settle into her chest, a clarity that cut through the warmth of the tea and the room, and the relief of simply being somewhere safe. So this isn't kindness, she said. This is strategy. You're not helping me because of what happened to me tonight. You're helping me because it damages him. Do-hyun did not deny it, and something in her almost respected him more for that than if he'd tried to dress the truth up prettier. Both things can be true, he said. I won't insult you by pretending I don't see the strategic value in tonight's events. You are the abandoned wife of a man I am actively working against, carrying a child with Kwon bloodline, humiliated publicly, in a way that has already started damaging his family's reputation among people who matter. That has value. I'm not going to lie to you and call this purely charity. He held her gaze steadily. But I also called you tonight, personally, before I'd worked out a single strategic angle, because I have known Taemin Kwon since we were 11 years old, and I watched him become someone who could stand at a podium and call his pregnant wife replaceable in front of 300 people. And something in me simply could not let that happen without doing something about it. Call that whatever combination of decency and self-interest you want. I won't argue with you about the ratio. Jessica sat with that honesty for a long moment, turning it over, testing it the way you test a floor, before trusting your full weight on it. There was something almost refreshing after months of Taemin's careful evasions and his mother's icy diplomacy about a man who simply told her, plainly, exactly what he wanted and why. Fine, she said finally. I appreciate you not pretending to be a saint. So tell me then, what exactly do you want from me, Mr. Choi? Because I don't believe for 1 second you brought me into your home tonight just to deliver an honest confession and a cup of tea. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or the particular respect a careful man feels when someone refuses to be managed. Not tonight, he said. Tonight I genuinely just want you safe, fed, and somewhere warm. Whatever I want to propose to you, and I do have a proposal, can wait until you've slept and eaten, and had a few days to simply exist without anyone in this city watching you. You've earned that much, at minimum. And if I say no to whatever this proposal is, then I'll arrange a quiet, comfortable life for you, somewhere far from Taemin Kwan's reach, ask nothing further of you, and we never speak of strategy again. He said it simply, without performance, and something in the flatness of it convinced her more than any elaborate reassurance could have. I'm not interested in trapping you, Jessica. I've seen enough of that already tonight to last me a lifetime. She stayed in the Hanok estate for 4 days before he raised the subject again. 4 days of the kind of quiet, careful tending she hadn't experienced since before her marriage had begun its slow collapse. A doctor came on the second morning, gentle and thorough, confirming what Jessica already knew, that the baby was healthy despite everything, that the stress of the wedding hall and the cold night walk afterward had not, by some mercy, harmed the pregnancy. An older woman named Mrs. Yoon, who managed the estate's household with the brisk efficiency of someone who had clearly seen a great many things in this house and discussed none of them outside its walls, brought Jessica meals at careful intervals and never once asked a single prying question. Do-hyun himself was present, but not overbearing, joining her for dinner most evenings, asking about her work in Lagos before her marriage. Listening, she noticed, the way Taemin had listened in those early courtship days, before the listening had quietly stopped. By the 4th evening, sitting across from him at a low table set with more food than she could possibly finish, Jessica found herself studying his face and asking the question she'd been turning over for days. "What's the proposal?" she said. "I'm rested. I'm ready to hear it." Do-hyun set down his chopsticks and regarded her for a long moment before he spoke. "Marriage," he said simply. "Not romantic, not immediate, not performed for anyone's comfort but ours. A strategic union, between myself and you, that accomplishes several things at once." He held up a hand before she could react, asking for patience. "Let me explain fully, before you say anything." "Please," Jessica said, though her heart was already hammering. "First," he said, "it protects you and your child completely. Under Korean law, and more importantly, under the particular customs of the world Taemin belongs to, a woman married to someone of equal or greater standing within the network cannot simply be discarded or threatened without consequence. Right now, tonight, you are vulnerable in ways you may not even fully understand yet. Taemin's mother does not forget, and she does not forgive humiliation, even humiliation she herself orchestrated. If you remain unprotected and unattached, there are people in his world who would see you as an easy way to quietly tie up a loose end." He let that settle before continuing. "Second, it sends an unmistakable message throughout every circle that matters to Taemin Kwan, that the woman he discarded was claimed, within days, by a man more powerful than he is. That is not a small thing in our world. That is a wound that does not heal quickly. And third," Jessica said quietly, already understanding where this was going. "Third," Do-hyun agreed, "your child, depending on how the Kwan family bloodline interacts with certain old agreements within the network, may carry inheritance claims that Taemin's mother has spent decades trying to consolidate entirely under her own line. I won't pretend I fully understand the legal architecture of it yet. I have people studying it. But there is a real possibility, Jessica, that the child you are carrying is far more significant to certain old families in this city than either Taemin or his mother currently realizes." He paused. "Which means, married to me, protected by my name and my resources, that child becomes something neither of them can simply erase." Jessica sat very still, her hand resting instinctively over her stomach, feeling the truth of his words settle into her, like stones dropping into still water. "You're talking about my baby like a chess piece," she said quietly. "I need you to understand that I will not agree to anything that turns my child into a weapon. Not for you. Not against Taemin. Not for anyone." "I understand that completely," Do-hyun said, and something in his voice softened in a way she hadn't heard from him yet. "And I want to be clear, because I think it matters that you hear this plainly. Nothing about this marriage requires your child to be anything other than exactly what they are, a child who deserves safety and love. I am not proposing to raise your son or daughter as a strategic asset. I am proposing to give them a home where nobody will ever again stand at a podium and call their mother replaceable." He held her gaze steadily. "The strategic value to me is real, and I won't insult you by hiding it. But the protection I'm offering you and your child is also entirely real, and it does not come with strings attached to how you choose to raise them. Before we continue, a quick note for everyone who loves these mafia boss romance stories. I've bundled 20 of our most loved Afro-Korean romance stories into the Ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection. You'll get all 15 complete stories, 20 audiobook versions, plus 5 exclusive bonus stories you won't find on YouTube. If you'd love to enjoy these stories anytime, without ads or interruptions, you'll find the link in the description below. Jessica was quiet for a long time, long enough that Do-hyun did not push, simply waited, watching the candlelight flicker across the low table between them while she worked through everything he'd offered. Finally she spoke, her voice careful, measured. "If I agree to this," she said, "I want terms. Real ones. Written down, witnessed. The kind of agreement that protects me even from you, if it ever came to that." "That's fair," Do-hyun said immediately, without a flicker of offense. "I'd insist on it myself, frankly, if our positions were reversed." "I want full financial independence," Jessica continued, counting the terms off the way she'd once counted off negotiating points in business meetings back in Lagos, the old instincts surfacing now that she had something concrete to push against. "Not an allowance, not access through you. My own accounts, my own resources, enough that if I ever need to walk away from this arrangement, I am never again standing on a cold street with nowhere to go because some man decided to control everything attached to my name. Granted," Do-hyun said, "I want full decision-making authority over my child. Schools, upbringing, religion, everything. You can be involved as much or as little as the situation requires for our purposes, but you do not get final say over how I raise my own son or daughter." "Granted," he said again, and something almost like the beginning of respect, or perhaps amusement, was building in his expression as she laid out term after term with the precision of a woman who had clearly decided she would never again enter any arrangement without protecting herself first. "And I want honesty," she said finally, her voice dropping, the negotiating tone falling away into something rawer. "Real honesty, every single time. Even when it's inconvenient for your strategy. I have spent the last several months of my marriage being managed, Mr. Choi, being told vague reassurances while the real decisions happened in rooms I wasn't invited into. I will not survive that again. If you ever lie to me, even by omission, even for what you consider a good reason, I need you to understand right now that I will walk away from this arrangement, and I will take everything I've negotiated with me, and I will not look back." Do-hyun held her gaze for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice had lost every trace of the careful diplomatic register he'd used since she arrived. "I give you my word," he said simply. "Not because it's strategically convenient to say so, because I watched a friend become someone who lies to the people who trust him most, and I have spent a long time deciding I did not want to become that kind of man myself, even in a world that often rewards exactly that." He paused. "You will find me difficult in other ways, Jessica. I am not an easy man, and I won't pretend otherwise. But I will not lie to you. That much I can promise absolutely." She studied him in the candlelight, this stranger who had pulled her off a cold street 4 nights ago, and was now offering her a marriage built on protection and leverage rather than love. And she felt something settle in her chest that was not quite trust, not yet, but was perhaps the foundation trust could eventually be built on. "Then I accept," she said quietly. "Not because I forgive what's happened to me, not because I've healed from any of it, but because I have decided, sitting in this house for 4 days, that I am done being someone things happen to. From now on, I am going to be someone who makes things happen instead." Something shifted in Do-hyun's expression then, brief but unmistakable, an admiration he did not bother trying to hide. "Good," he said simply, "because that, Jessica, is exactly the kind of partner I was hoping I'd found." The marriage took place 11 days later, in a quiet ceremony, at the same Hanok estate, witnessed by a small, careful circle of people, whose presence alone signaled, throughout every relevant network in the city, exactly how seriously this union was meant to be taken. There was no white dress, no string quartet, none of the performance that had defined her first wedding. Jessica wore deep green silk, chosen because Mrs. Yoon had quietly suggested it suited her, and stood across from Choi Do-hyun in a small candlelit courtyard, while an officiant read words that bound them together as partners, allies, a unified front against whatever came next. She did not feel love standing there. She felt something else entirely, something sharper and more useful in that moment. The particular, electric clarity of a woman who has decided, finally, that she will never again let anyone else write the terms of her own survival. News of the marriage reached Tae-min Kwan by the following morning, delivered not through any official announcement, but through the much more devastating channel of whispered gossip moving fast through every circle that mattered to him. Within 48 hours, his mother's closest friends had heard. Within a week, his business partners knew. And by the time Tae-min himself fully understood what had happened, that his discarded, pregnant wife had walked directly from his humiliation into the protection of Choi Do-hyun, his most significant rival within the network. The damage to his standing had already begun spreading through Seoul's elite circles like ink through water. Impossible to call back. Impossible to fully contain. He showed up at the Hanok Estate's outer gate 4 days after the wedding, alone, without his security detail, looking, for the first time in longer than Jessica could remember, genuinely shaken. She watched him from an upstairs window as Do-hyun's household staff politely but firmly informed him he would not be permitted entry. Watched the particular helpless fury cross his face as he realized, fully, for the first time, exactly what he had thrown away and exactly who had been waiting to catch it. She did not go down to speak with him. There would be a time for that conversation, she knew. But it was not this one, and she was no longer the kind of woman who rushed toward confrontation simply because someone else demanded it of her. That night, as she sat in the quiet of her new home, with one hand resting against the gentle movement of her unborn child, Jessica allowed herself, for the first time since that wedding hall, to feel something close to peace. The world she had stepped into was complicated and dangerous in ways she was only beginning to understand. Built on alliances and rivalries that stretched back generations, populated by people who measured loyalty in leverage and language that always meant something more than it said on the surface. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not simply surviving inside someone else's decisions. She was, finally, beginning to build something entirely her own. Gayuj Kak. The first months of her new life with Choi Do-hyun did not look anything like a marriage in the way Jessica had previously understood the word. There was no easy intimacy between them, no shared mornings over coffee, no casual reaching for one another's hands. Instead, there was a careful, deliberate building, two people learning to navigate the same space without crowding it, two people slowly discovering that respect, given consistently and without condition, could grow into something neither of them had expected to find inside an arrangement built on strategy. Do-hyun kept his promises, every single one. He never once spoke to her about the baby in the language of leverage again, never reminded her of the bloodline value he had laid out so plainly that first night, and slowly, almost without her noticing it happening, Jessica found herself looking forward to the evenings he was home. She gave birth on a cold morning in late winter, in a private hospital wing that Do-hyun had personally arranged months in advance, surrounded not by Tae-min's cold mother or his careful staff, but by Mrs. Yoon, fussing gently over every detail, and by Do-hyun himself, who paced the hallway outside with an anxious energy that surprised Jessica when she heard about it afterward, given how composed he managed to remain about literally everything else in his life. Her daughter arrived just past dawn, small and furious and undeniably alive, and Jessica held her for the first time and felt something inside her chest crack open and rebuild itself entirely around the tiny weight in her arms. She named her Faith, a name her own grandmother back in Lagos had carried, meaning Princess of the People, and something about choosing that name herself, without consulting anyone, without seeking permission from a single Kwan family elder, felt like its own small, fierce act of reclamation. Do-hyun came in slowly after the nurses cleared the room, hesitant in a way she had never seen from him, as though the careful confidence he carried into every boardroom and every negotiation deserted him entirely at the threshold of a hospital room holding a newborn that was not, biologically, his own. He stood at the edge of the bed for a long moment, looking down at Faith with an expression Jessica couldn't quite categorize, something between wonder and a carefulness that bordered on fear. "May I?" he asked quietly, and Jessica, exhausted and aching, and more open than she had allowed herself to be in months, simply nodded and shifted the baby toward him. He held her like she was made of something fragile enough to shatter at the wrong angle, his large hands suddenly uncertain in a way nothing about him had ever seemed uncertain before. "She's furious," he said softly, watching Faith's tiny face scrunch in indignant protest at being moved. And something in his voice cracked, just slightly, with what might have been the beginning of real affection. "I think she's going to be exactly as stubborn as her mother. God help us all," Jessica said, and the laugh that escaped her, tired and genuine, was the first real laugh she'd allowed herself in months. He stayed for 2 hours that morning, simply sitting beside the bed, occasionally glancing toward the baby, with that same careful, wondering expression. And somewhere in the quiet of that hospital room, watching this man who had married her for strategy hold her newborn daughter like she was something precious rather than something useful, Jessica felt the first real crack appear in the wall she had built around her own heart since that wedding hall in autumn. But Seoul's elite circles do not pause for tenderness, and the world outside that hospital room had not stopped moving while Jessica built something new for herself within Do-hyun's protection. Tae-min Kwan's empire, the one he had so confidently restructured around an arrangement with Han Yu-jin, had begun, slowly and then with gathering speed, to show cracks of its own. The shipping routes his family had been quietly courting through, Han Yu-jin's textile connections, collapsed when two key partners, longtime allies of Do-hyun's side of the network, abruptly withdrew their support, citing concerns about the Kwan family's judgment and stability that everyone in the room understood to be a polite, devastating reference to the wedding hall scandal still rippling through high society months later. Madame Kwan, who had once believed she was orchestrating her family's ascension by replacing an inconvenient foreign daughter-in-law with a politically advantageous one, found herself instead presiding over a steady erosion of everything she had spent decades building. The assemblymen who had once courted Tae-min's favor at dinners began returning his calls more slowly. The board members who had once deferred to his judgment started, quietly, in private conversations he was never invited to, discussing whether the family patriarch's son had the temperament required to lead the conglomerate's next chapter. And worst of all, from his perspective, Han Yu-jin, the woman he had publicly chosen as his future, began to reveal exactly how thin her loyalty had always run. It began with small things. The kind of erosions Tae-min was too distracted by his collapsing business deals to fully register at first. Yu-jin started attending fewer family functions, citing exhaustion, illness, scheduling conflicts that always seemed to multiply the moment the Kwan family's social standing took another public hit. She grew distant in their private conversations, her once bright enthusiasm for their future together replaced by a careful, calculated wariness that Tae-min, in his arrogance, mistook for simple fatigue rather than what it actually was. A woman recalculating her own position now that the man she had aligned herself with was looking increasingly like a losing bet. The truth, which Tae-min would not discover for several more devastating months, was that Han Yu-jin had never loved him, not in any way that resembled what Jessica had once genuinely felt for him in those early courtship years. Yu-jin had been raised, much like Tae-min himself, to understand marriage and alliance as instruments of family advancement, and she had entered their arrangement with clear, cold eyes, calculating that attaching herself to the Kwan shipping empire would secure her own family's textile fortune for another generation. She had never anticipated that the very public, very humiliating manner of Tae-min's divorce would damage the Kwan name so severely that her own family's reputation began suffering by association, her father's calls to old business partners suddenly going unreturned, her mother's invitations to society luncheons quietly drying up. She confronted Tae-min about it on a rainy evening in early spring, nearly 5 months after the wedding hall scandal, standing in the doorway of his study with an expression that had none of the soft adoration she had once performed so convincingly. "My father is furious," she said without preamble. "3 of his oldest business relationships have gone cold since your divorce became public. People are saying your family's judgment cannot be trusted. They are saying it directly to him now, not even bothering to be subtle about it." She crossed her arms. "You told me this arrangement would elevate both our families. Instead, I am watching mine suffer for a decision you made in a wedding hall in front of 300 witnesses. A decision, I should add, that you never once discussed with me beforehand, despite the fact that I was the woman you were publicly humiliating your pregnant wife in front of." "This is temporary," Tae-min said, though something in his voice had lost the cold certainty it once carried so easily. The market will stabilize. People forget scandals eventually. Will they? Yujin's voice was sharp now, cutting through whatever reassurance he was reaching for. Because from where I'm standing, the woman you discarded is now married to Choi Do-hyun, protected by resources and connections that make your family's position look increasingly fragile by comparison, and every single ally that mattered to your father's generation is quietly recalculating whether the Kwon name is still worth their loyalty. She shook her head, something almost like pity crossing her face, though it was the cold pity of someone calculating an exit strategy rather than genuine concern. I did not sign up to be attached to a sinking name, Taemin. I signed up for advancement. If this continues, I am not going to be the one left standing beside you when the rest of it collapses. She left that night and did not return his calls for nearly a week, and when she finally did respond, it was through a brief, formal message announcing that she believed it would be best, given the current business climate, for both families if their arrangement was reconsidered. Taemin Kwon, who had stood at a podium 5 months earlier and called this woman his future in front of 300 people, found himself, within half a year, abandoned by the very alliance he had sacrificed his marriage to secure. There was no public scandal this time, no humiliating scene witnessed by elite society. There was only the quiet, devastating realization that everything he had thrown away his pregnant wife to obtain had evaporated entirely, leaving him with nothing but the damage left behind. Meanwhile, in a household across the city that Taemin had no access to and increasingly limited information about, something far more consequential was beginning to surface, something that would eventually make the textile alliance he'd lost look like the smallest possible casualty of his decisions that autumn night. It started with a phone call Do-hyun received late one evening, nearly 7 months after Faith's birth, from a contact deep within the older, more traditional families that had governed the network's foundational alliances for nearly a century. Jessica, sitting nearby with Faith asleep against her shoulder, watched Do-hyun's expression shift through the conversation, watched the careful stillness that came over him when something significant was being discussed, and felt her own pulse quicken with the particular instinct she had developed over months in this world, the one that told her important things were happening just beyond the edges of what she could fully understand yet. When he ended the call, he sat for a long moment in silence, staring at nothing, before he finally turned to her, his expression unusually careful, even for him. "What is it?" Jessica said, her arms instinctively tightening around her sleeping daughter. "Do-hyun, you're scaring me. What did they tell you?" "There's an old agreement," he said slowly, choosing his words with obvious deliberation, "that goes back nearly 4 generations, between the Kwon family and several other founding houses of the network. It's the kind of agreement most people in our world have stopped thinking about, because it was written for a different era, drafted by men who believed certain bloodline contingencies would never actually need to be invoked." He paused. "It establishes succession terms for the network's foundational leadership council in the event that a primary bloodline fails to produce a legitimate heir capable of fulfilling certain obligations." Jessica felt something cold move through her chest, an instinct telling her exactly where this was going, before he finished explaining it. "Taemin," she said quietly. "Taemin's mother has been positioning him for nearly 15 years to eventually claim a seat on that founding council," Do-hyun said. "It's part of why the family pushed so hard for an heir aligned with the right strategic marriage. Han Yujin's family carried old council connections of their own, which is exactly why Taemin's mother orchestrated that arrangement in the first place." He met Jessica's eyes steadily. "But the agreement is built around legitimate Kwon bloodline, Jessica. Not specifically Taemin's children with any particular wife. Any child born of his direct bloodline, recognized formally, carries a legitimate claim." The room went very still. Jessica looked down at her sleeping daughter, at Faith's small, peaceful face, utterly unaware of the storm of consequence apparently gathering around her tiny existence, and felt the weight of what Do-hyun was telling her settle slowly into place. "You're saying my daughter," she said, very carefully, "has a claim to this council seat. Through Taemin, despite everything that happened. I'm saying the old families who maintain that agreement don't particularly care about wedding hall scandals or who is currently married to whom," Do-hyun said. "They care about bloodline, about legitimacy, about which child can be formally recognized and presented to the council when the time comes. And Faith, whether Taemin or his mother like it or not, is the only living Quan heir currently in existence. He paused, and something careful entered his voice. Which means, Jessica, that your daughter just became one of the most significant figures in our entire world. And everyone who matters within the network is about to know it. The news did not stay contained for long. Information of this magnitude, within a world built almost entirely around the careful management of leverage and alliance, never stays quiet. And within 2 weeks, whispers had begun moving through the network's oldest circles, the kind of whispers that eventually find their way to exactly the people who need, desperately, not to hear them. Madame Quan learned of it from an old family friend at a tea gathering she had attended for 30 years, delivered with the particular cruelty of someone who phrased it as concern while clearly relishing every word. "I heard," the woman said, stirring her tea with deliberate slowness, "that the child your son discarded along with his first wife may actually be the only legitimate claim your family has left to the founding council. How fortunate, I suppose, that you didn't manage to chase her completely out of the country." Madame Quan did not respond for a long moment, her composure, the very thing she had built her entire identity around for 60 years, cracking visibly in a way none of her old friends had ever witnessed before. She had spent decades orchestrating every detail of her son's future, calculating marriages and alliances with the precision of a woman who believed she understood every variable in play. And she had never once considered, in all her careful planning, that the foreign daughter-in-law she had so thoroughly humiliated might be carrying the single most valuable asset her family's entire legacy depended upon. She summoned Taemin to her estate that same evening, and Jessica, hearing about the confrontation secondhand through Do-hyun's network of contacts, could almost picture it perfectly. Madame Quan, 60 years of icy composure finally cracking under the weight of her own miscalculation, and Taemin, the man who had once stood so confidently at a podium and called his pregnant wife replaceable, now discovering that the child he had so casually dismissed was the very foundation his family's entire future now rested upon. "You let her go," Madame Quan said, according to the account that eventually reached Do-hyun's ears, her voice shaking with a fury that had nowhere productive left to land. "I told you to handle the situation delicately. I told you the optics needed managing. I did not tell you to humiliate her so completely in front of 300 witnesses that she would run directly into the protection of Choi Do-hyun, of all people, the one man in this city positioned to make absolute certain we never see a single day of benefit from that child's bloodline claim. Mother, I didn't know." "You didn't think," Madame Quan cut in, her voice cold enough now to match the very iciness she had always demanded of her son. "You wanted Yujin's textile alliance so badly, you couldn't see past your own ambition long enough to consider what you might be throwing away in the process. And now Yujin has abandoned you. The textile alliance is worthless, and the only legitimate Quan heir on the council's radar is being raised by our family's most dangerous rival, who I imagine is taking considerable pleasure right now in exactly how thoroughly you've destroyed your own legacy with your own hands." Taemin stood in his mother's sitting room and felt, for what might have been the first time in his entire adult life, the full and crushing weight of his own decisions. Decisions he had made so carelessly, so certain of his own power and his own untouchability, that he had never once paused to consider the woman standing in that doorway might someday become something far more dangerous than the wife he'd discarded. He thought of Jessica's face that night in the wedding hall, the steadiness in her voice, even as he humiliated her in front of everyone who mattered to him. And for the first time, standing now in the wreckage of everything he had built, he understood exactly what he had thrown away. "I have to fix this," he said quietly, more to himself than to his mother. "There is nothing left to fix," Madame Quan said, and something in her voice, beneath the fury, carried the unmistakable weight of genuine fear. "Choi Do-hyun does not lose leverage once he has secured it. And you, my son, have just handed him the single greatest advantage anyone has held over this family in 3 generations. Across the city, in the warm quiet of the Hanok estate, Jessica sat with Faith in her arms, watching the lights of Seoul flicker through the lattice windows, and allowed herself, finally, the smallest, most carefully guarded smile. She had walked out of that wedding hall 8 months ago with nothing but a crushed invitation and the particular grief of a woman who believed her entire life had just ended. She had not understood then, standing barefoot on that cold street, exactly what she was walking toward. But she understood it now, completely, holding her daughter close, while the family that had once cast her aside as replaceable began, slowly and irreversibly, to understand exactly what they had lost. Jessica had known would eventually come, arrived on a gray afternoon, nearly a year after that wedding hall, when Taemin Kwan, stripped of his textile alliance, watching his father's board members quietly maneuver to limit his future authority, and finally, fully understanding the cost of his own arrogance, requested through formal channels a meeting with the woman he had once called replaceable in front of 300 witnesses. Do-hyun had brought the request to her carefully, laying it out without pressure in either direction. "You don't have to see him," he said. "I will turn this request away myself if that's what you want, and I won't think less of you for it." Jessica had sat with the decision for 2 days before answering. In the end, it was not closure she wanted. Not exactly. And it was certainly not reconciliation. It was something closer to completion. The final word in a chapter she had spent a year carefully rewriting in her own voice instead of his. "I'll see him," she said finally, "but not in his world. He comes to mine." He arrived alone, without security, without the careful entourage that had once trailed him through every room he entered, and Jessica watched from the Hanak Estate's sitting room as he was shown in, looking older than his 36 years, the easy confidence that had once defined him, replaced by something hollowed out and uncertain. He stopped a respectful distance from where she sat, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence carrying the particular weight of everything unsaid across a year of devastation on one side and rebuilding on the other. "You look well," he said finally, and there was no performance in it, only a kind of exhausted honesty that surprised her. "I am well," Jessica said simply. "Sit if you'd like. This won't take long either way." He sat, perched on the edge of the chair across from her, like a man unsure he'd earned the right to occupy it fully. "I came to ask," he began, and then stopped, started again. "I came to ask if there's any version of this where you would consider letting me back into Faith's life. Not as your husband. I understand that's gone, and I understand exactly whose fault that is. But as her father, I would like the chance to know her." Jessica studied him for a long moment, weighing the request against everything she had built in the years since that wedding hall, against the careful, deliberate life she had constructed for her daughter, with a man who had never once made her feel disposable. "That's not my decision to make alone forever," she said finally. "When Faith is old enough to understand who you are and what happened, I will tell her the truth, all of it, without softening it for your comfort or for mine. If she decides, with full understanding, that she wants you in her life, I will not stand in the way of that. Children deserve the right to make those choices for themselves eventually." She paused. "But I want you to understand something clearly, Taemin, because I don't think you've ever fully understood anything about me clearly in all the years we were married. You didn't lose me when you chose Yu Jin. You lost me the moment you decided, somewhere in the privacy of your own mind, long before that wedding hall, that I was replaceable. Everything after that was simply the moment the rest of the world found out what you'd already decided." He flinched, visibly, and something in his face crumpled in a way she had never once seen from him in 4 years of marriage. "I made a mistake," he said quietly. "The worst one of my life. I know that now. I knew it that night, actually, watching your face while I said those words. But I was too proud and too frightened of my own mother to do anything but keep walking forward into it anyway." "I believe you," Jessica said, and she found, surprisingly, that she meant it. "But believing you doesn't change anything about where we are now. I'm not interested in revenge, Taemin. Despite everything your mother and half this city probably believe about why I married Do-hyun, I'm not sitting here trying to destroy you for the satisfaction of it. I built a life because I needed somewhere safe to stand, and it turned out that somewhere safe came with genuine partnership and genuine respect. Things I should have had with you and never did." She stood, signaling, gently but unmistakably, that the conversation was reaching its end. "Go home, Taemin. Rebuild whatever you can rebuild. I hope, genuinely, that you find some version of peace in it. But you do not get to walk back into the parts of my life you decided I was disposable to. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That choice belongs to me now. And to my daughter when she's old enough to understand it belongs to her too." He left without arguing, without the desperate pushing she had half expected from him, and Jessica watched him go from the doorway of the home she had built without him, feeling something settle inside her chest that she could only describe, finally, as peace. That evening, after Faith had been put down for the night and the house had grown quiet around them, Do-hyun found Jessica on the wooden veranda overlooking the estate's small garden. The autumn air carrying the particular crispness of a season that, a year ago, had carried her into the worst night of her life. He settled beside her without speaking at first, simply sharing the quiet. The way he had learned, over months of careful partnership, was often exactly what she needed most. "How are you feeling?" he asked eventually. "After today." Jessica considered the question seriously before answering, the way she considered most things now, carefully, deliberately, refusing to let anyone else's expectations shape her response before she'd fully examined it herself. "Lighter," she said finally. "I think I needed to say those words to him out loud, not for his benefit, but for mine. I needed to hear myself say them, and know I meant every word." She glanced over at Do-hyun, studying his profile in the soft evening light. "Can I ask you something honestly?" "Always," he said. "When you called me that night," she said, "on that cold street, you told me both things could be true. That you were helping me out of decency and out of strategy, and you wouldn't pretend the ratio leaned entirely one direction." She paused. "I want to know, now, a year later, what that ratio actually looks like to you. Honestly." Do-hyun was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally answered, his voice carried none of the careful diplomatic distance he'd used so often in those early days. "If I'm being completely honest with you," he said, "the strategic value stopped mattering to me somewhere around the third week you were living in this house. I kept telling myself it was still part of the calculation, because that felt safer than admitting what was actually happening, which was that I had started looking forward to dinner every evening, simply because you'd be sitting across from me, asking sharp questions and refusing to let me get away with vague answers, the way everyone else in my life had learned to let me." He turned to face her fully. "I think, if you're asking me honestly, the ratio shifted entirely a long time ago, Jessica. I don't know exactly when, but it shifted completely, and it hasn't shifted back since." Jessica felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in her chest, something she had been carefully, deliberately not naming for months, because naming it felt dangerous, felt like reopening a door she had spent a year teaching herself to keep firmly shut. "I think," she said slowly, "I've been feeling something similar for a while now, and not letting myself look at it too closely, because the last time I trusted those feelings completely, I ended up standing barefoot on a cold street with nowhere to go." "I understand that fear," Do-hyun said quietly. "I'm not going to pretend I can promise you it will never happen again, because I think promises like that are exactly the kind of thing that ring hollow after everything you've survived. But I can promise you this, completely and honestly, the way I've tried to keep every promise I've made you since that very first phone call. I am not Tae-min Kwan, and I never intend to become a version of myself that could stand in a room and call you replaceable. Not for strategy, not for my mother's approval, if I had one demanding it, not for anything." She looked at him for a long moment in the deepening evening light. This man who had pulled her off a cold street with strategy in his voice and had, somewhere in the months since, become something she had genuinely stopped expecting to find again, and felt the last careful wall she had built around her own heart, finally, gently, begin to come down. "I think," she said softly, "I'm ready to stop calling this arrangement Do-hyun. I think I'd like to start calling it something closer to what it's actually become." Something shifted across his face, careful hope breaking through the composed surface he carried into every other room in his life. "And what would you like to call it?" he asked quietly. "A marriage," Jessica said simply. "A real one. Built slowly and built honestly, the way I think the best ones probably have to be." The years that followed were not without their difficulties, because no real life, built by real people, navigating real consequences, ever moves forward without complication. Madame Kwan never fully reconciled with the reality of her family's diminished standing, watching from a careful distance as the Kwan shipping empire steadied itself eventually under new leadership, her son rebuilding slowly, humbled in ways that Jessica would later learn through the careful channels that still connected her to that world, seemed to genuinely reshape him over time. Tae-min did not remarry quickly. He spent the years instead, according to what reached her, trying to become someone capable of holding the kind of honest accountability he had so thoroughly failed at the first time. And when Faith turned 12 and asked her mother, with the particular bluntness only children possess, whether she wanted to meet her biological father, Jessica told her everything, completely and honestly, exactly as she had promised herself she would. Faith chose eventually to meet him, cautiously and on her own terms. And what grew between them afterward was careful and imperfect, and entirely hers to navigate, exactly as her mother had insisted it should be from the very beginning. Han Yujin's textile fortune never fully recovered from the damage of that single scandal. And the last Jessica heard of her, second-hand through circles that still occasionally crossed paths with her own, she had married into a far less prestigious family, the particular irony of which Jessica chose not to dwell on for longer than the brief moment of recognition it deserved. And Jessica herself, the woman who had once stood in a wedding hall doorway, with a crushed invitation shaking in her hand, built a life across the years that followed that bore no resemblance to the careful, managed existence she had once accepted as the cost of being loved by a powerful man. She returned, eventually, to the career ambitions she had set aside for her first marriage, building a consulting practice that bridged Korean and African business interests, drawing on every hard lesson the network's world had taught her about leverage and patience, and the particular power of a woman who refuses to be underestimated twice. Faith grew up fierce and brilliant, and entirely unbothered by the complicated politics of the world she'd been born into, raised by a mother who had decided, on a cold night a year before her birth, that she would never again let anyone else write the terms of her own survival, and a stepfather who had kept every single promise he'd made in that candlelit sitting room, year after year, without exception. Some betrayals, Jessica came to understand, looking back on that night across the years that followed, don't actually destroy you, no matter how completely they feel like the end while you're standing inside them. Sometimes they simply reveal, with brutal and necessary clarity, exactly who was never meant to stand beside you in the first place, and exactly how much stronger you become once you stop waiting for someone else to decide your worth and start deciding it entirely for yourself. If this story moved you today, if you found yourself rooting for Jessica from that very first moment in the wedding hall doorway all the way through to the family she eventually built on her own terms, I want you to do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because we have so many more stories like this one waiting for you. Drop a comment below and tell me honestly, would you have chosen revenge, forgiveness, or reinvention if you'd been standing exactly where Jessica was standing that night? I read every single one of your comments, and I love hearing how these stories land with you. Imagine having 20 more unforgettable mafia boss romances ready to read or listen to whenever you want. That's exactly why I created the Ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection. Inside, you'll find 15 complete stories, 20 audiobook versions, and 5 exclusive bonus stories that aren't available on YouTube. You can get instant access through the link in the description. Like this video if you want to see more powerful women rising from exactly the kind of rooms that tried to convince them they were small. And if you're new here, welcome to the family, because we tell stories like this one every single week. And trust me, you do not want to miss what's coming next. Until then, stay strong, stay hopeful, and never let anyone in any room, anywhere, ever convince you that you are replaceable. I'll see you in the next story.